Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am Harry Lausanesiris, and this is my YouTube channel grecochess. In this video, we conclude the presentation of the 2025 Connecticut Open chess tournament that took place on Saturday, September 20th. Before we show the game, however, let's first show the details of the tournament. It took place in 4 rounds, which means that every player was expected to play 4 games facing 4 different opponents. You get 1 point for win, half for draw, and 0 for loss. And whoever accumulates the most points is the winner. The various sections. As you see here, there was an open section where everyone was eligible, but in practice, it's usually the strongest players that participated because they are not eligible for the other ones. The under 2100, meaning your rating had to be below 2100 to be eligible. The under 1700, similarly, your rating had to be below 1700. And having a rating of 1582, I joined that section. Then there was under 1200, under 700, and for players without the USCF, United States Chess Federation rating. Time control. For my section and for all sections of U1200 and above, it is G45 plus 10. What does this mean? It means that when the game starts, every player has 45 minutes on their clocks. When your opponent is thinking, of course, your clock does not move. When it's your time to think, the clock continues from where it stopped and goes downwards. But after you complete your move, you get 10 extra seconds. That is the plus 10. It's the increment, as it's called. This can make the games last very long because you may be low in time, but if you gain 10 seconds in every move and if you play fast, you can accumulate quite a lot of time. And before we continue, let me share with you a couple of photos I took from the place to have an idea. The first one is from the entrance of the building. The moment you enter the building, this is the registration table. You see for every section, there is the list of participants. You can check your name to see if you've been properly listed. And as far as I know, there were no issues with that. There were 2 nice statues to the left and to the right that I love to see, and the logo of the university in the middle. And behind that is a playing hall, which we're going to see now. This is a playing hall. At the very front, University of Bridgeport is where the open section will take place. The best players will sit somewhere here, and the weakest players near here, near where I took the photo. An interesting detail is you see on every table the chessboard and the pieces are already placed by the organizers. And later on, after I took the photo, but before the tournament started, the organizers would place the clocks properly calibrated to reflect the 45-10, meaning 45 minutes with 10 seconds increment, the time controls. And I really need to thank the organizers because this made the players' life so easier, so simple. We only had to worry about the chess and not about all these details. And out of all the tournaments I participated, I've seen only 2 of them where the organizers took care of it. Chesarity in Long Island and the Connecticut Open in Bridgeport. Thank you very much to organizers of both of them. Now we go to game number 4. If you've seen my previous videos, I've won rounds 1 and 3, lost round 2, so I have 2 out of 3 points, which means I'm far from the bottom. Even if I lose, at least I'll have a 50% success. If I win, I'm near the top, but I believe I have no chance to win it. But let's see who was my opponent. And let me modify appropriately the web page so it will be easy to view it. As you see here, his name is Kevin Zimmerman. His rating is 1500 and he's in the 83 point. Let me highlight it so you see where it is. And he's in the 83.4 percentile. Compare this with my numbers. My rating, official rating is 1582, but um, after my participation in the New York State Championship in Albany and the Chessanity one in Long Island, it is going to go up to 1609. And I am in the 87th percentile, meaning out of every 100 players of the United States Chess Federation, I'm better than 87 and worse than the other 13 players. This means that, in theory, I'm the favorite, but let's see what actually happened on the chessboard. Let me adjust my screen. Once again, on the left half of the board, you're going to see the chessboard. It is from the chess.com, the analysis. On the right half, below the word analysis, you're going to see the computer evaluation. Who the computer thinks is doing better. Positive number means white is doing better. Negative means black is doing better. Computer will show every move if it was the best or not, and if not, which would have been the best. And for the other player whose turn is to come, which are the best three options they have. Kevin had the white pieces and I had the black. And Kevin starts with the e pawn that goes to e4. For the first two moves, it's going to be the theory. You're going to see book move. I reply with the French. French is one of the most popular words, together with the Sicilian, pawn to c5, or the symmetric, pawn goes to e5. There's also the Alekhine defense, knight goes to f6. The Caro-Kann, pawn goes to c6, and quite a few other options. I play the French because I'm mostly familiar with that, and I feel more comfortable, not that it's really any better. Kevin places his knight on f3. Usually the second move you place your pawn on d4, but also you can place your knight to f3 instead. I occupy the center, my pawn goes to d5. Kevin advances his pawn to e5. By doing so, he blocks my knight to go to f6. My knight has to go either e7 or h6 and puts quite a lot of pressure on my position. And I'm trying to counteract that and get space by moving my c pawn to c5, controlling the d4 square. And at this point, Kevin pushes his pawn to b4. This is a book move, but it's quite a gambit. When I saw that, I was a little bit concerned because I knew that Kevin did not offer me the pawn out of the kindness of his heart. I'm sure that he had very well studied what would follow. I would temporarily get a pawn, and then if I didn't play correctly, I could be demolished. That is why I was very, very, not only reluctant, refused outright to get a pawn. And I decided to get even more space from chessboard by moving my pawn to c4. The computer doesn't like it. In accuracy, would rather have me take the pawn, but this is because the computer could play very successfully the rest, while myself, not having faced, I'm not sure if I have ever faced this kind of gambit, uh, it would be easy for me to make mistakes and lose it. So I still don't regret that I didn't take the pawn. Kevin pushes his pawn to d3, wants to get rid of the pawn here. Inaccuracy. And I decide to exchange because the pawn at c4 would not be very stable. I take it and Kevin takes it back with his c-pawn. Computer thinks it is a mistake, start giving some advantage. The moment he did that, I knew I could safely take the pawn on b4 because by this time I knew that, not I knew, I can never be sure, but most likely I thought that it would be out of his preparation. I take the pawn on b4, I'm up a pawn, I'm checking, meaning winning a tempo. Kevin defends by placing his knight on d2. I continue developing, knight goes to c6. And he pushes his pawn to d4 to protect better the e5 pawn. My bishop goes to c3, and I'm attacking the rook on a1. I was expecting the rook to go to b1, and then I would think how else to attack. For example, knight could go to b4 and threaten the pawn on a2. There will be other ways. But I was a little bit surprised when I saw his bishop go to a3. Mistakes in the computer gives me huge advantage of 2.41. Of course, once again, I knew that Kevin did not do it by mistake. He did not just miss this fact. But what can I do? I need to take the rook while I still can and hope that Kevin's compensation is not that big. So I take it. I take the rook. Kevin takes. Inaccuracies in the computer would rather have me strengthen my attack. But still, instead of 265, I have an advantage of 201. Queen takes it. I have an advantage of more than 2 points and exchange on a pawn. But this does not guarantee a win. You've seen many other games where the advantage is going back and forth. So if I want to be able to convert to victory, I must be very careful. What is my next issue? My next issue is that the f8 square is controlled by the bishop, so even if my knight disappears, I cannot castle. I send it to e7, so now I can castle. Kevin sends his bishop on b5, pinning my knight at c6, and I castle. This is nice in the sense that I finally castled, but my knight on e7 is pinned. If it moves, my rook on f8 is lost, and I have to give back the exchange. Kevin decides to take my knight. Of course, I'm not going to take it back with my knight because I lose my rook. Take it with the pawn, and the c6 pawn is what is called a backward pawn. It cannot be protected by a pawn on the b or d file. The b doesn't exist. The d has already moved to d5. And it can only be protected by pieces. So the time being, the knight on e7 supposedly protects it, but it's also pinned. I might be able to protect my bishop, especially light colored bishop with light colors pawn, but I really need to worry if it's attacked. Kevin castles. And finally, I unpin my knight. I move my rook to e8. Rook goes to c1 for Kevin. And now I start feeling the pressure. Because if he could play again, he would take my knight. And no matter how I take it back, the pawn at c6 is lost. In order to avoid it, bishop goes to d7. I didn't want to put the bishop on b7, although it's in a long diagonal, because queen or rook could go to b1 or queen to b2, and they would attack the bishop. And it have to think how to defend. Queen goes to c3 for Kevin, for white. My knight goes to g6. So don't have to worry about protecting it. And soon it could go to f4, for example, or somewhere else and start creating its own threats, hopefully. Bishop goes to d6 for white. That is a very strong move because at d6 it controls a lot of squares near my king. It controls b8, c7, e7, f8. And if I'm careless and put any of my rooks or my queen there, it is lost. And if it's a queen, if it's a rook, at least I just give back the exchange. But if it's a queen, that's it. I lost a game. And as you know from chess, computers don't make these mistakes, but humans, even high-level players, might make these mistakes. You always have to keep this in mind. And if I want my piece, my queen or my rook to go to a better square, but need to go temporarily through these dark colored squares, it will not be possible. I'm ahead and I want to exchange material because I'm ahead in material. So knight goes to h4. Computer doesn't like it, and my advantage goes down to 0.60. Kevin decides to exchange. If not, the knight is very dangerous there. Knight goes to f3 for white and attacks my queen. Queen goes back all the way to d8. Computer thinks it's a mistake. Would rather have my queen on f4 and be in the attack. If anything, now white has advantage of 0.03, a very small one, but me having much more material and the computer giving advantage to my opponent, even so small, is not a positive ominous, I would say. And Kevin starts to try his attack. Pawn goes to h4. And even it's the best, the computer can see now one move ahead more than before and starts giving me the advantage of 0.15. I decide to counterattack on the other side. Why didn't I stop it to h5? Because then the knight would go to g5 and it would be very dangerous. So I decide, let's see what we can do on the other side. How far can we push the a pawn? a5 first. Kevin pushes his pawn to a3 and I push my pawn to a4. See how far the a pawn can go. If I can get rid of the white a pawn, then my pawn could go down and get promoted, or at least could create havoc in white's place, and I might win something else like that. Queen goes to a3 for white. And my rook goes to a5. Now, without the pawn on a7 being all the way to a4, my rook is free to move towards the center of the board. Rook goes to c3, and my rook goes to b5. By doing so, my rook occupies the open b file. It could not do it from a8 because b8 is controlled by the bishop. The result is, in order to control the open b file, I had to use two moves instead of one. That is one of the issues that the bishop at d6 is causing. And in internet games with very low time control, sometimes I've made this mistake and put the rook on b8 and lost it. Of course, here with the 45 minutes, I had quite enough time to think and avoid this mistake, but still it's inconvenient to need two moves to put my rook on the b file instead of one. And Kevin can see that my rook is too free and then can be joined by the queen on b6 or who knows what else. And in order to block my rook from having such influence, he sends his bishop on b4. My queen really goes to b8. And I'm trying to exert as much pressure as possible on the b file, and the only thing stopping me from having full control is this bishop on b4. Kevin decides to continue his attack. On the king side, pawn goes to g4. G and h pawns could potentially create trouble for me if they advance a little bit more, especially if they exchange pawns with my pawns and then my king is exposed. At the time, I made a big decision. What I could see is that the dark-colored bishop, whether on d6 or on b4, was controlling crucial squares and would make my life very difficult or perhaps even impossible. It would create a huge fortress that would not allow me to go for victory. And if anything, if I was not careful, the g and h pawn could give the win to Kevin. And that's why I made a major decision commitment. I checked it many times to see there is no immediate harm. And I decided to give back the exchange, but I would also get a pawn in the meantime. Since I'm already a pawn ahead, if I give back the exchange and they get a pawn, I am 2 pawns ahead. So I took a big risk, and now the computer sees that this is the best move, but during the game I had no way to know it. So I take the pawn on b4, and computer thinks it's a brilliant. Well, I really think it's a great brilliant. I made it out of desperation, not because I could see 20 moves ahead, but out of desperation because I quote unquote hated the white bishop, and because two pawns, especially one of them being a pass pawn, outside pass pawn, is extremely strong, I said, let's try it. If it works, it works. If it doesn't work, I learn, as I like to say. Of course, Kevin takes back my rook, queen goes to b4. You see, now I have two extra pawns, and one of them on a4 is passed pawn, meaning there are no pawns in front of it. And in addition, it is outside, meaning it's far from the action, meaning it cannot be stopped by pawns, and the white would have to take some time to bring the pieces to stop it. And at this point, we completed the first 25 moves. The computer gives me an advantage of 2.05. Of course, the computer had seen in advance that this is the best thing for me to do. If I didn't do it, I don't think I would have been back so much. Let's see. I'm going to go back and see what would happen. What are the next moves for black? For black, the next possible move was rook to go to c8, but this basically means prepare it or queen to b6. They're just moves that would prepare later the rook goes to b4. So the computer wants me either immediately to take at b4, give back the exchange, the best move, or if I don't do that, do it at the next possible move. The computer cannot even imagine I wouldn't sacrifice my rook for the bishop and the pawn. Kevin continues his attack, pawn goes to g5. And at this point, I started feeling nervous. What will the G and the H pawns do? Kevin's only hope. I don't want them to go to the 6th rank and exchange and expose my king, so pawn goes to g6, but the moment I played it, I was very much aware of the holes I was creating on f6 and h6. Computer thinks it's inaccuracy. Still, I have advantage, a little bit less than before, but I was worried about the f6 and h6 holes. If the knight would go there, if it goes to f6, it's automatically fork and I lose my bishop. h6, if queen can go to f3, for example, there's a danger for f7. And the knight is not easy to go to the squares for the time being because it's blocked by its own pawns. It has to step on its pawns to go there. Although there was one easy path, if it went to h2 and g4, for example, that could happen. That's why the computer that thinks the best next move for white is a knight to h2. Because from there could go to g4 and later on either f6 or h6. Myself, all I knew is I had to do it at that moment to stop pawns going to the 6th and 7th ranks and being exchanged. And I would keep an eye on where the knight would go, how to block its path one way or the other. And definitely make sure that the 4 white pawns stay on d4, e5, g5, and h4 so they don't make easy the job of the knight. And move number 27, instead of placing the knight on h2, white is scared of a potential check and sends his king to g2. My rook who's going to a8 to help support the pawn from a4, go towards promotion. At this point, it would go to a3 because it would be attacked twice by rook and queen, defended twice by queen and rook. And the knight is too far away to stop it, so if I could play a second move in a row, clearly pawn goes to a3, then to a2, and one way or the other, it would either promote or white would have to sacrifice a piece to stop it. And that is why white plays the move I expected. The rook goes to a3, so the pawn physically cannot continue. It's blocked by the rook. My rook goes to a5. My whole story now, my whole thought, mistakes is a computer and just to 105 advantage. But my whole thought now is how to attack the rook on a3 and force it to move. I don't care where, because no matter where it moves, pawn goes to a3. Of course, ideally, if I could have everything the way I like it, the rook would go to the h-file, but I knew that was not going to happen. White sends the queen to c1 to have better protection of the c-file. And perhaps if my bishop moved from d7 to, let's say, go to c8 and then to a6, the pawn on c6 would be lost. Myself, I decide to continue the mouse. The pawn goes to c5. It's attacked twice by the pawn on d4 and the queen on c1, defended twice by the rook a5 and the queen on b4, so it cannot be taken. Queen goes to a1. More pressure, not only supporting the rook, but more pressure on the a4 pawn, but the computer thinks it's inaggressive. And my advantage becomes 3.12. Myself, I already have one passed pawn on a4. Why not have a second one on c4? Computer would rather have me have taken the d4 pawn. I felt very nice because with two passed pawns, a4, c4, it seemed that the road to victory would be quite smooth. If I took on d4, then the knight would go to d4. No, it could not. The queen would take it, but I would create. No, it could go because attack. The knight would be defended by the queen. Yes, the knight could go to d4. You see here what would happen. If I took went to d4, knight goes to d4. And really, I don't want the knight to go back to defense. And the knight could go to c2, attack my queen. I don't want the knight to be in the game. My rook would have to go back to a8, perhaps to avoid some kind of a fork. And from now on, yes, I have a third pawn. Yes, if I took, no, I wouldn't. The knight would take it, I wouldn't. Still have two pawns. I didn't like this position at all. And I still cannot understand why the computer thinks that my move, my pawn move is a mistake. If it's a inaccuracy, perhaps, or not, or good. But have it a mistake? Okay, let's see what will happen. King goes to g3 for white. White wants the king to exert pressure because white understands that the knight and these two pawns, g and h, are not enough, even the e pawn. And if the king becomes more active there, white might have a chance. Computer thinks a mistake. My advantage now becomes 3.10. Mero goes to a6. King goes to g4. And my rook goes to b6. Why did I go there and not directly to b5? Because I wanted my bishop on d7 to protect the pawn on a4. If I first if I went directly to b6, then white could easily take my pawn because my bishop is not covering it. If I move my rook to somewhere else to attack it, the rook could defend itself. That's why it took me two moves to go to b6 to the b file instead of one. But look at the good thing now. My pawn on a4 is protected by my bishop. And since bishop is more important than the rook, even the rook and the pawn combined, my rook and queen are free to go anywhere they like so long as my bishop stays in this diagonal that goes from b5 to e8. I felt some relief there because I don't want to have my queen and my rook getting stuck to protect the pawn. The queen and the rook could even go to the other side of the board and still, if white would take my pawn, they would lose the rook and I would have even higher material advantage. Computer thinks this is the best move. I have an advantage of 4.1. We completed the first 32 moves, which means basically one column of the score sheet. My advantage is 3.93. I have two passed pawns, a4, c4. The one is outside on a4. The other is protected, the c4, protected by the d5, which is protected by e6 and by f7. I have a wonderful pawn chain of 4 pawns that starts from f7 at the end of the board, near my king at the end, and goes to e6, d5, c4, ends up with a protected passed pawn. All I need now is some time to see if I can push at least one of these two pawns to promotion. Pawn goes to h5 for white. I don't want to take the pawn because if I take it, king goes to h5 and uh, the white king is near my king. Of course, the king cannot checkmate me, but with the help of knight, rook, and queen, they can easily, especially the queen, can switch sides and create danger to my king. And being a heavy material, I wanted to exchange queens because white's hope is to use the queen with the help of the pawns to checkmate me. My hope does not so much rely on the queen, but on at least one of the pawns getting promoted. That's why my queen goes to b2. Inaccuracies as a computer would rather have me take the pawn. Maybe for the computer, for a human, if you're not careful, queen can suddenly go h1 and in these squares, and we could be near mate. Near mate for white. White takes my pawn on g6. The computer would rather have it go to h6 and have the queen perhaps go there. Another time, I'm sure it's going to be a mistake because I could have taken the pawn first. You don't want the pawns to be so far ahead. But I decided to take the white queen since I could take it. Otherwise, I was afraid if I took the pawn, queen goes to h1 and I could be in danger. And that's why I take the queen on a1. Let's see what the computer thinks about. It's good, not a mistake, not the best. White will take a pawn because it comes the check, so they can take the queen after that. Take on h7 check. And my king takes the pawn. Sometimes the king is better not to take the pawn, to use it as a kind of a cover so the rook cannot check. I was a little bit worried because there's another pawn next to that. There's a king. What if they could create more pressure? I mean, in theory, they could even checkmate the king on h6 without even the pawn promoting. So I take the pawn. Rook goes to a1, as expected. And now my whole point, the whole situation is as follows. Can I push the pawns to promote at least one of them? While white, their only hope is knight and rook, with the help perhaps the king, create a mating pattern. I cannot push the A pawn, is going to be taken, so I push the C pawn. It goes to C3. Two squares away from promotion. Rook goes to H1 to check. King goes to G7. Rook goes to H6. If knight could go to H5, it could check and things could be dangerous for me, but it needs 4 moves to go there. Let's see how it would go. Perhaps 1, 2, 3, 4. But it cannot go in less than 4 moves. My advantage becomes 645 on the computer. The computer would rather have white defend, stick the rook on a1. But defending, I wouldn't advise for anyone. If you're behind in material, if you're completely behind, try to counterattack, not just defend, even if that objectively could be the best move. If I play perfectly, white has no chance, so try to make me cause a mistake, try to make me excited, push my pawns when I shouldn't, while using king, knight, and rook to create mating attacks. My pawn goes to c2. Can the pawn be stopped? Let's see. The knight cannot stop, it's too late. No matter where it goes, the white knight, my next move is pawn to c1. Of course, the pawn cannot go backwards. The king is too far away. The rook could go to h1 to stop it. If that happened, I would put my rook on b1. So white is in a difficult situation. If we exchange rooks, the pawn promotes. What else can white do? Perhaps put it to g1 to be covered by the knight to exchange rooks again. Pawn promotes. White, the only option is forget about my pawn and continue the attack and hope for the best. King from g4 goes to h5. Yes, have the king as near my king, and perhaps with the help of the rook and the knight create mating attacks. And with some luck, they could even checkmate me. I can have all kind of queens on the other side. I may have both of A and C pawn promoted to 2 queens, but see my king having no place to go. Can this happen? Let's see. My pawn promotes at this point. I get my queen. 11.1 is the advantage that the computer gives me, and I don't see any mating chance for black, excuse me, for white. I don't see any kind of danger, but I'd better keep an eye on it. It may come when I least expect it. Rook goes to f6. Queen goes to h1 with a check. And white decides to reply by covering with a knight. My other pawn goes to a3 now. Time to start pushing the other pawn. Mating 11 says, or mating 10 says the computer. I reach a point where the evaluation gives me an M. M means mate, and then in how many moves, assuming both sides play perfectly. Pawn to g6. The danger is that if white could play again, rook goes to f7 checks and then wins my bishop. Still I'll be losing, but better not enter that territory because instead of taking my bishop after f7, my king goes to the 8th rank, then it's not so easy for the king. The king could go to h6, me not because I'm taking the knight with the check, but still I need to be careful after that. What do I play? Let's get rid of this pawn. And Kevin takes my pawn on g6 with a check. I'm still very much ahead, but I still need to be very careful. I'm quote unquote lucky, unfortunate that the knight on h4 is pinned, so it cannot contribute the attack. If it could, my life would be much tougher. My king goes to f7. Rook goes to f6, check again. Maybe Kevin was hoping back and forth, threefold repetition. My king will go to e7. King goes to g5, and the knight is not pinned any longer. If white could play again, knight could go to g6 check. My king cannot go to d6 because the pawn has to go to perhaps t8 or e8. And who knows what? Oh, things could be tough. If white could play again, knight goes to g6, and no matter where, if king goes to e8, it's checkmate, rook to f8. If it goes to d8, it check, and then white will have to place their bishop. And then white might have a chance for a checkmate. Still, I don't think it's that high, but I would really need to be very cautious and very defensive. But it's my turn to play. And I took another huge risk. I was scared of the knight. Knight and rook can create some of the what are called Arabic knights or Anastasia knights or who knows what. They have some very fancy names. And since I have a pawn that will become a queen, I said, let me get rid of the knight, even if it costs me my queen. Queen goes to h4 check. Excellent. As a computer, my advantage will become a little bit less than before, but now I don't have to worry about a sudden combination of rook and knight creating a mating threat out of nowhere. King, of course, will take it. My pawn goes to a2. I'll have a queen like that. I'm still winning. Even without it, even without the pawn, I have an extra bishop here, which at least can guarantee a draw. King goes to g5. Pawn goes to a1 with, now I have a second queen. Rook goes to f4. My rook goes to b8. King goes to h6. And queen goes to g1. I'm 3 moves away from mate. If I could play again, of course, rook goes to h8 and mate. Most likely, the king would first go to h7 for white to postpone it, but then rook goes to g8, and white might think of dropping one check or rook on f7, and that's it. At this point, we are 3 moves away from checkmate, and Kevin resigned. At this point, I conclude my participation in the tournament with 3 out of 4 points, 3 wins and 1 loss. Overall, it took me to the 4th place out of 31 participants in the under 1700 category. Unfortunately, prizes went only the top 3, so I barely missed. Kevin, of course, congratulations. You played a very good game. Using your dark-colored bishop and playing your d6 was a great move that created a lot of problems for me, and you forced me to give back the exchange. But let's see, what does the computer have to say? We'll click the button that says review. It says that I had 81.1 percentage versus 72.6 for Kevin. I played as if my rating was 2100. Wow, flattering once again. While Kevin's was 1600, a little bit better than his own. How do we do in the categories? I had one brilliant move, and this brilliant move was when I gave back the exchange. It's not very common to get brilliant moves, so I'm glad that at least the computer gave me one. No great moves, best moves. 18 for me, 9 for Kevin. Excellent, 12 for Kevin, 9 for me. Good moves, 7 each of us. Book moves, 4 for Kevin, 3 for me. I went off the book the moment I refused to take this pawn on b4, and instead pushed my pawn from c5 to c4 in my 4th move. In the negative category, 10 inaccuracies for Kevin, 5 for me, 4 mistakes for Kevin, 3 for me, 2 misses for Kevin, 3 for me, and Kevin had 1 blunder. This concludes my coverage of this game and of the Connecticut Open. Once again, thanks to the organizers that made the players' life very simple without having to worry about boards and especially about setting the clocks, because for me, making sure my clock is setting correctly and testing it and always running the danger that the clock will be out of battery in the middle of the game or may malfunction is quite a headache. The organizers took care of this headache. And after I played with 4 players with ratings lower than mine, and even if I had 3 out of 4 wins, my rating didn't change too much. It went up just 3 points from 1609 to 1612. I had a very nice experience. Ladies and gentlemen, what next? I'm continuing at the Queen's October tournament. I have already played 3 rounds until now. This Friday is round number 4. From tomorrow or from the next video, whenever it is, I'll start showing the games I have already played. There are going to be totally 5 rounds there. So this Friday is round number 4. Next Friday, round number 5. And we'll see how I did at that tournament. Thank you for watching. Thanks to the subscribers. Thanks to the ones that click the like buttons. And to some nice comments I had. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Harry Lasaniziris. This is my grecochess YouTube channel. Goodbye.